Right. Now, that was an illusion. If, after being told by my parents what it was really about, and I kept on saying that is water, then that would have been a delusion. Now, we have a situation here in Australia where so many of our decision makers are holding an illusion. But when they have the facts, as so many of them do, and choose to ignore them, then it becomes a delusion. But we've been polite, and at this stage we're calling it an illusion. Now, we're very privileged to have Professor Bob Carr here today to launch this paper for us. Now, Bob is one of those people of which we say he needs no introduction, but of course he does. Because he's very special to us. He is one of Sustainable Population Australia's patrons. And I think he first came to our attention when he was the Premier of New South Wales, and he said, "Sydney is full." And our eyes just lit up. It was like, oh my goodness, who is this man? And we asked him to become a patron, and he agreed to. And then later on, as Foreign Minister for Australia, he also impressed us, so much so that I sent him a bunch of flowers, because he announced that Australia was doubling the component in its aid budget from 25 million to 50 million a year for overseas family planning and contraception, which again is very, very dear to our heart. So without further ado, I would invite Bob Carr to launch this paper.
Sandra, Lee, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's a great honour to launch the paper. To us it seems very, very logical, and to the majority of Australians it's logic as well. I'm interested in all the opinion polls that show Australians by bigger numbers gravitating to the position we all hold, and that is that there is a carrying capacity about our continent. And we meet at a time when all the information out of the drought simply confirms the logic of that. How many towns are in the position in New South Wales of running out of water? How many have you heard? That underpins one of the key arguments in this paper, and that is the myth of decentralization. It's one of the oldest myths in Australia. It's got mythic force. Sandra used brilliantly delineated the difference between illusion and delusion. It is one of the great Australian illusions. The question's got to be put. Well, Goulburn, Dubbo, Wagga, these are cities with vulnerable water supplies, very vulnerable. People talk about decentralisation as if we're dealing with North America with a great mountain range and rivers flowing down both sides. We haven't got that in Australia. We're a narrow, fertile coastal strip. And I was very proud as Premier to declare a lot of additional coastal national parks. And one of the things I was aware of as I signed off, I remember one marvellous day in 1999 after we just won re-election, signing a piece of paper that declared an additional 100 parks between Nowra and the Bega Valley. I was very conscious that we were getting coastal land for nature conservation purposes before developers got it for population sprawl. And I remember a dinner party conversation where a real lively population is someone who coincidentally had his personal wealth in development, talking about how I got it wrong. And I said, well, listen, my friend, I don't know where your options are, because I'm on a search, I'm on a safari for any more headlands or coastal zones that I can lock up in the national park estate. If that's explicitly limiting your options, then that's a large part of my intention. So decentralisation, Donald Horne wrote in one of his books in the late 60s about great coastal cities, and he spoke of it, nominated Jervis Bay. Which citizen of New South Wales would want to see a great city in Jervis Bay? Our ethos has changed. We think an area like that ought to be conserved. But it's going to be harder to conserve it with remorseless population pressure, such as we've seen. So the notion of decentralisation has got to be rebutted. The options aren't there, and there is not the security of water to render it feasible in inland Australia, nor the available land in coastal New South Wales. And I think that's true of Queensland. The notion that we can catch up with infrastructure has been disproved. My government, 1995 to 2005, pushed infrastructure spending to an all-time high in real terms. In real terms, we were and this excises the Olympics from the calculation, we were spending more on infrastructure by a factor of a third than had been spent in the 1980s. And towards the end of my time as Premier, we were 2/3 up on what had been the average for the 80s. And then the current government, the coalition government, has privatised the bulk of electricity and the ports, massive privatisations, and has said all this is going into infrastructure. But then we know there's not enough for hospitals. Hospital budgets are being squeezed, and there's a backlog in every category of government responsibility you can think of in infrastructure. And it's simply because we know it's obvious. The annual intake into the Sydney Basin is running at up around 100,000, where in the past it ran, these are approximate figures, to the best of my memory, around 60,000 per annum. And that adds up. That adds up. I was out at the Prince Henry Hospital site. When that old hospital was closed, I was local member and Premier. I was involved in the decision. We said we would underdevelop the site. It was around Little Bay Beach. It's on the coast. We would underdevelop it. So you've got a few aged care and apartment dwellings, 5 stories. I think the bulk of it is about 3 stories. There's open space and optimal protection of heritage, the old hospital wards, and a nurses' museum and a senior centre, a lot of public use. Harry Triguboff has got a development application to take one of those sites. It's a University of New South Wales owned site. They're selling it off, and the open space around it. And when Randwick Council knocks back his proposal for a 22-storey tower, he will use New South Wales's planning laws to override them. So on a site where the maximum development is 5 stories, there'll be a 22-storey tower, which is an invitation for developers to come in and to acquire land on this site, which we consciously had said would be underdevelopment. A lovely environment for mixed use, a lot of retirement living, but families living in apartments. It's bordered by some public housing, social housing, and thick with community facilities. I was there for a lunch celebrating 25 years of the senior centre there. So it's just an ideal development that is now going to be transformed by the rush for high rise generated by the population pressure and a government saying we've got to tilt the balance in the environmental planning and assessment system to favour high-rise development. So this is transforming our city, and a very eloquent chapter in this report refers to the death of the Aussie backyard. Well, I was coached when I was planning minister, 1984 to 1988, by my department to say, look, the best development is the best plan for a region within the city is one that offers a mix of densities. Think of Darling Point, the plan has said. Darling Point has got towers, it's got townhouses or villa houses, it's got single detached dwellings. That sort of mix is defensible. But we're losing that mix now. We're losing that mix. We've gone from a system that in the 70s or 80s had too few opportunities for apartments to one that's got no opportunities for anything other than apartments. That's a slight exaggeration, but that is the direction we are headed in. Let's return to infrastructure though. The cold hard truth, the report says, is that the quantity of infrastructure investment required for a big Australia is mind-boggling and impossible to meet. And none of the politicians in Canberra who wax so eloquent about the need for us to be the big Australia will say, but Australians, here's the message you really want. We are making a commitment for the first time in our history that linked to every new arrival beyond a certain benchmark, you might say 20,000 or 50,000 in one of our capital cities, there'll be a Commonwealth government commitment equal to, and then we can have the options listed. An extra 1/8 of a kilometre of metro, an extra 1/8 of a kilometre of light rail. There should be a formula. But we've never had that formula. And without that formula, you are precisely right in this report, and I think Australians understand it. The tidal wave of ambitious, adventurous, high immigration will overwhelm the capacity of stretched state and federal budgets to keep pace. It's a common sense position, and you make it very well in the context, as I said, of the loss of the Aussie backyard and the loss of nature conservation. The pressure around our great natural areas, which we thought were there forever, of high density development is very real. I hike in the Royal National Park because it's so convenient and the sandstone cliffs are so beautiful and precious. But how is that park going to be more than a sort of dog park, or one might say a feral cat or fox park, when of necessity, in 30 years' time, say, Engadine and all those other suburbs have been transformed with higher densities? Oh, and by the way, how do you have the dream of a city with 7 million, 10 million, without those higher densities? Harry Triguboff and I had a sort of half humorous debate once when he said, I want towers in the national parks around Sydney. And I was very happy that Harry had that playful intervention in the public debate, because it helped me drive home the educative message that I was busy as Premier planting, and that is, there are and must be economic alternatives to Australia than the one that says remorseless population growth is the only way to keep our population going. It's a constant debate, a constant argument, but you're vital because you can ring up ABC talk programs, and I encourage you to do it. You can write letters to the editor, there's a lot of wisdom in those letters columns. You can post comments on articles that appear in online news, and in this paper, I've got to say, Sandra, are all the killer facts you need on each aspect of this problem. A lot of us owe a debt to Paul Ehrlich, and I was honoured last Friday night before last, to have dinner with him in Sydney. He and his wife Anne, a great ecologist in her own right, come to Australia as they've done for decades, over 40 years I think, because they're such keen bird watchers. And I remember in 1970 watching him on Monday Conference put the astonishingly simple proposition that had been in the back of my mind, but which I'd never heard anyone articulate. That is, the population of the planet keeps on growing, and he referred to the increasing pace of this. So since he was since he was in Australia in 1970, how many have we added to the world's population? What was it then? Has it doubled since 1970? I'm groping for the figures. If I'd had time, I would have looked them up. But we're told we've got to contemplate a remorseless rise from 7 billion to 10 billion before there's any prospect of it evening out. And that's frightening. But Ehrlich spoke with such clarity. The author of the population bomb spoke with such clarity, and he said, in some countries, population doubles every 35 years, and he instanced Kenya. Everything he said in 1970 has been absolutely confirmed. He's been wrong on none of this. Everything he said in 1970 about the increasing rate of population growth has been absolutely confirmed. In some respects, we haven't had the disasters he spoke about, but there were disasters he didn't speak about that we have had. If he had said in 1970 that there'd be cities on the planet where the air quality was so bad that schools would have to be closed, people would wear face masks, and it would be equivalent to, what would you say about the air in Delhi these days? That you wouldn't be able to see the other side of the street. His views would have been dismissed as outrageous dystopia, an outrageous dystopia. He didn't say that, he didn't predict that. He would have been laughed at if he'd said that. But now we've got cities on the planet that are in that condition, and you've got pollution from fires in Java and Sumatra, again something he didn't predict, he would have been laughed at if he predicted it, that are polluting the skies of Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. You might have got wrong some predictions, but we've now got a reality of plastics in our ocean that he didn't predict. If he had, he would have been seen as entirely alarmist. What a ridiculous notion that the oceans would fill with plastics. That was only in 1970 that he was warning of things as drastic, but not long ago. Things have been far worse, plastics and air pollution, than he tipped at the time. We've avoided massive famine, yes, he got that wrong. But on these other fronts, he understated the economic disaster. I tracked down the transcript from the ABC archives. I was great tribute to the ABC that they had kept them. They've, like other organisations, they've lost so much of their archival treasures. I pulled it out. Ehrlich, speaking on Monday conference in 1970, question time, a woman in the audience gets up and she says, I've just read an article in Nature. It's about a change in the climate of the planet. And she said, it's very worrying. She was talking about global warming. This could be the first mention in the popular media in Australia that the climate was changing. And Ehrlich said, yes, I know the article you're referring to. This phenomenon has got a lot of us very worried. He said it could have a contrary or a paradoxical impact. There could be areas where global warming produces more rainfall. So this discussion was eerie. It sent shivers down my spine. 1970, in an ABC studio between Ehrlich and an unnamed woman in the audience at question time, in this little exchange that pointed to the dominating anxiety that the human species must have this short time later in 2019. And the instincts of Ehrlich were right, and your instincts are right. This is a splendid report that helps us to win arguments. The encouraging thing is that what I said as Premier, Sydney is full, is now being echoed by a State Premier here and a State Planning Minister. They're saying the same thing. But to be right before your time is, as always, to be wrong. But it was good throughout this to have your support. Thanks very much. I launched the report. It's a splendid one.
Do you want me to introduce you?
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll get this ready.
All right, so our next speaker is Leith van Onselen, who describes himself as the unconventional economist on his blog Macrobusiness, but he really is a proper economist because he's worked for the Australian Treasury, the Victorian Treasury, and Goldman Sachs. He is the lead author of the report, and I invite him now to perhaps talk a little bit to that report.
Thanks very much, Sandra. Bob Carr's always a tough act to follow, but I'll give it a go. So why do we care about population growth? Well, it's pretty obvious. It is the everything issue. It affects every single aspect of our life. How long you spend stuck in traffic, whether you can find a seat on the train, whether you can afford a decent-sized home, a reasonable commute from work. Sorry. There we go. Whether or not you're able to water your gardens, in the case of Sydney, whether you can ask for a pay rise because of increased competition in the labour market, and of course environmental amenity. Now, as I'm sure everyone in this room is well aware, Australia's immigration intake has tripled over the past 15 years. So we went from the historical average of around 70,000 per year in the 100 years from Federation to running by about 210 to 220,000 per year over the past 15 years. Sorry. And this is projected to continue indefinitely, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Now, the ABS releases demographic forecasts. And the one I've got up here is on the right-hand panel is actually the middle forecast. So this is the business as usual forecast. And the ABS has Australia's population rising by 17.5 million people over the next 48 years. A massive increase. So how does this compare historically and compared to other nations? Well, since 2003, Australia's population has increased by 2.5 times the rate of the OECD average. We are by far the fastest growing population in the Anglosphere, and population is extreme. And Australia's major cities are actually projected to double in size over the next half century. So we're going to have Sydney and Melbourne with populations of around 10 million people. Brisbane is going to be a population the size of Sydney, roughly. And Perth is going to be around 4 million people, according to the ABS's middle projection. And as you can see on the right-hand panel here, which just tracks Sydney, all of Sydney's population growth, 4.5 million roughly, is going to come from net overseas migration. So that's both as people step off the plane, as well as have future children. And in fact, without positive net overseas migration, Sydney's population would actually fall slightly. Now, I don't have the chart here, but for Melbourne, it's a very similar story. Without net overseas migration, Melbourne's population would rise by about 500,000 over the next 48 years, versus around 5.2 million under current immigration settings. So Melbourne would more than double in size. And one final point to make is that mid-century, in 50 years, Sydney and Melbourne's population each will be roughly the same size as the entire Australian population was in 1960. So we're going to have two massive metropolises. Now, Bob mentioned it, and it's mentioned in the report, that we're losing the Australian backyard. We're losing our famed quality of life. Now, I've got some projections here which are contained in the report showing Sydney's future dwelling profile. Now, this data comes from the Urban Task Force, which is basically a developer lobby. And currently, around 56% of Sydney's dwellings are detached houses, and around a quarter are apartments. But by mid-century, according to the Urban Task Force, only 1/4 of homes across the entire Greater Sydney area is going to be a detached house, and half are going to be apartments, with the rest townhouses. So what this basically means is that future Sydney-siders are facing a future where only the very wealthiest can afford to live in a detached house with a backyard. It's a complete reversal of what happened a generation ago. And this will all happen by mid-century, in only about 30 years. And as we all know, we see it every day when we drive our cars, catch trains, go to the hospital, send our kids to schools. Infrastructure is not keeping pace. Now, this chart here is not included in the report. This only came out last week, and it's by Engineers Australia. And what it shows is that over the past decade of hyper-immigration and hyper-population growth, Australia's infrastructure investment has actually fallen, according to Engineers Australia. Now, I've got a quote there, I won't read it out, but you can read it yourself. Basically says that Australia's experienced extreme population growth, yet nothing has kept pace. We have a whole bunch of data in the report from various sources, Infrastructure Australia, Engineers Australia, a whole bunch of other sources, which say exactly the same thing, that Australia's infrastructure is getting further and further behind, and it's all because it cannot keep up with our extreme population growth. That is 2.5 times the OECD average. But that's not all. It's bad now, but the future's actually looking a lot worse. Infrastructure Australia last year released detailed modelling for Sydney and Melbourne. Now, I've included Sydney here. In the report, we have both Sydney and Melbourne. And what it shows is that under every single development scenario for Sydney, whether Sydney sprawls, whether it builds up, or does a combination of the two, access to jobs, schools, hospitals, and open space will all get worse. Commute times will rise, as will traffic congestion. That's under every single development scenario from Infrastructure Australia, and that assumes strong infrastructure investment, as we've seen recently. So basically, we'll be going backwards. That is the official modelling from Infrastructure Australia, yet you never hear about it. And one more thing to add, this modelling only goes to 2046. Yet, as I showed earlier, under the ABS's projections, Sydney's expected to go to 9.7 million by 2066. So this modelling only is only for Sydney at 7.4 million. Imagine how bad it's going to get when Sydney gets to projected 9.7 million, as projected by the ABS. So all these figures here will get worse in every single category. And one final point I want to touch on. Bob touched on it. Water is the inconvenient truth. Now, Bob touched on the regional centres. I'll focus on Sydney here. Sydney's water supply is plummeting at a rate that is 50% faster than the millennial drought, which finished in 2006. Why? Well, it's pretty obvious. Sydney's population's increased by 1 million since then. Of course, there might be some climate factors, etc. But the big thing is Sydney's population has increased by 1 million, 20% since 2006. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. More people means more water. The average Sydney household consumes about 200 litres a day. Or sorry, the average Sydney person consumes on average, I think, 200 litres a day. Well, add 1 million to that, it's a hell of a lot of water. And guess what? As I said, Sydney's population is projected to rise to 9.7 million people. This will basically require a battery of desalination plants to be built right up and down the Sydney coast. There's a problem with that. The chart on the left-hand side shows the cost of desalination. The cost of running building and running a desalination plant is 4 times the cost of traditional dam water. So what does that mean? We're going to be building desalination plants, big energy-hungry, energy-sucking, environmentally destroying desalination plants up and down the Sydney coast to cater for a projected almost doubling of Sydney's population. Well, that inevitably means that costs for the typical household would rise. And according to Infrastructure Australia, their modelling, the real cost of water for Australian households, not just Sydney, but Australian households, is projected to quadruple over the next half century. And a lot of that has to do with A, reduced rainfall and evaporation, and B, being required to use technological solutions like desalination, which are incredibly costly to provide the water. But there's also another problem, as Bob mentioned. Regional areas, inner New South Wales, etc., Tamworth, Dubbo, Orange, these types of places, they're not near the ocean. So you can't desalinate to those areas. And also, the lion's share of new arrivals into Sydney are going out to Sydney's west, which is actually quite a long way from the coast, which requires big pipelines to be built, at least 50 kilometres, and also be pumped uphill, which costs a lot of money. These are all issues that none of the policy makers talk about. I'll just leave you with one concluding thought to show the situation that's facing us. It took Sydney 213 years to reach a population of 3.9 million people in 2001, roughly around the time of the Sydney Olympics. Currently, Sydney's population is about 5.2 million, and it's projected to hit 9.7 million by 2066. So that means that in 65 years, Sydney's population is meant to be 2.5 times the size it was in 2001, which took 213 years to reach. That is an extremely ridiculous scenario. It's even worse for Melbourne. Melbourne's population's expected to be 3 times the size that it was in 2001 in just an additional 65 years. Now, of course, we're already 18 years along this experiment, and the lived experience has been appalling. We've got congested roads, packed trains, packed schools, packed hospitals. We've got the building of high-rise slums left, right and centre, built to poor quality standards, flammable cladding, basically high-rise dog boxes. As Jeff Kennett once said for Melbourne, he said that he wouldn't let his dog live in them. And of course, in the case of Sydney especially, we've got the rising cost of living. Sydney is the most heavily tolled city in the world with toll roads. And it's just getting worse. Obviously, more people requires more expensive tunnelling, more expensive infrastructure, which also results obviously in toll roads, and everyone's average cost goes up. And who's it for? It's not making us better. It's making the fat cats at Transurban richer, and it's making developers richer. So the upshot is that a degraded future is facing Australians. They're going to be living in high-rise dog boxes, paying more for everything, spending longer to commute anywhere, and suffering from a degraded environment. Is this the future we want? I don't think so.
Thank you, Leith. We've got time for just a couple of questions either to Leith or to Bob, if anyone has them. Yes, right at the back. Yes. I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Sorry, currently the plans for Patron City out west and to take up population all the way up and monkeys going to be talked about. Is there any opportunity for completions of to try to get a rethink on taking
Okay, so it's about the development that's going to go all the way out.
well, I mean, Harding approaches the Frisbee's approach with Jason Commission. That means going all the way out through mountains, going all the way down.
So you want to know if there's any opportunities to turn it round. You changed that.
Well, it's the approach of sustainable population Australia. You cannot change it without addressing numbers, because you keep up that super ambitious immigration intake. Leith said this, and I say, as a former planning minister, a former premier, the response is the city goes up or it goes out, or more likely a combination of the two. So there will be a meeting of the relevant committee of the State Cabinet, probably the Budget Committee, where they will look at the projections and they will tick off on options, and those options will be, first, increasing densities within the inner ring and the release of land on the city fringes. When Barry O'Farrell cancelled a sensible plan to lift densities along the North Shore line, Ku-ring-gai, being resisted by the local council, he represented the area in Parliament, a sensible plan to have towers around the railway stations on the North Shore line, as an alternative, of course, to changing the nature of the whole suburb, he rejected that. And when I read that, I thought, well, Barry, as Premier, you've got the power to do it, and you'll get a favourable front page in your local newspaper, and some of your constituents will cheer, but that simply mandates that there will be tens of thousands of additional blocks of land required on the urban fringe. You keep pumping up the population, a city goes up and goes out. It's as brutal as that.
This is a question for Leith. Sustainable Population Australia is a think tank. To get change, you need people in state, federal and local government in elected positions to influence decision makers and bring about change. What do you see the role of a effectively single issue party like Sustainable Australia is in all tiers of government at having some influence at a political level?
Well, before we get on to the Sustainable Australia, I just want to point out, Bob touched on it. The key problem we've got is this vertical fiscal imbalance that's embedded in the Federation. So basically, we've got a situation where the Commonwealth Government collects 80% or 82% of the nation's taxation revenue, whereas the states and local governments collect the remaining 20% roughly. So we've got this situation where the feds run this big migration policy because it benefits the federal budget because they don't pick up the cost. So they gain from the rising company taxes and rising personal income taxes that comes from more people, but they kick the cost to the state government. Now that is the nub of the issue. You got this wedge between the two levels, and I think Bob's solution there was have an agreement where for every X number of migrants that come in, the feds have to kick this much money for roads, whatever, is a great idea, because that sort of breaks down this vertical fiscal imbalance. It makes the feds not just pick up the benefits from growth, but also the costs, and will make them rethink their policy. But there needs to be some kind of institution first. So I think that's the key political problem. Obviously, having Sustainable Australia in as many areas as possible is good. I think they're running for local elections now. The problem is they're having a lot of trouble, obviously, breaking in and getting representation. They've only got one elected representative currently in the Victorian Parliament, and my understanding is, unfortunately, the media doesn't give them a whole lot of sway. So, look, change has got to come from us, demanding more of our elected representatives, and it's also we've got to say got to come from the state government. Bob mentioned that the New South Wales government has said some good things about cities full, etc. That's true, and they did say a lot before the state election. But since the state election here in New South Wales, they've actually gone pretty silent. And Rob Stokes actually attacked baby boomers, I think it was last week, for being NIMBYs and opposing development. And he also, a couple of days ago, said that it's basically impossible to stop growth and that we've just got to put up with it. And that's really the wrong thing that we need from our state governments. True, the feds control immigration policy, but could you imagine if the biggest state government in the country, the centre of political power, properly stood up to the feds and said, cut this. Our citizens do not want this growth. We cannot take it. Put up or shut up. Cut the immigration intake or stump up the funds, and they did it forcefully and they did it consistently. You could actually force the feds' hands. But unfortunately, since the election, they've sort of gone back into this, we've just got to take it and it's inevitable, I'm not even sure it's undesirable, this kind of notion. Probably didn't really answer your question, but anyway. Just basically vote for Sustainable Australia. Yes, that's the only thing to say.
Up the back there, question.
My question's for Mr. Carr. Mr. Carr, it's Steve Trask from Australian Associated Press. I'm sorry to go off on a little bit of a tangent. I wanted to ask you, while I've got the opportunity, for your views on the China-Australia relationship.
Could we leave, perhaps you can sort of bail him up afterwards on that one, okay? Okay, one more question then on the report, if there is one. Yes, okay.
Are you hearing any positive voices in Parliament about the sustainability of person elected in Victoria? anybody else addressing the issue within the major parties or even the minor parties?
Anybody know of anyone?
Look, unfortunately, no. Yeah, Clifford Hayes is doing his best down in Victoria, but he's obviously pushing against a, massive dam wall, which is about to burst the other way. Look, unfortunately, the only elected representatives who ever raised the immigration issue, and they do it the wrong way, is One Nation, which yeah, it's great they mention it, but they always do it, with racist overtones, nationalistic sentiment, etc. Which is the wrong way to do it, and actually ends up being self-defeating for us, because as soon as we try and raise legitimate concerns, you're shouted down as being a racist or xenophobic, etc. And it's very easy to then play the race card, which is very unfortunate. But apart from them, no, there's not really any other parties. Unfortunately, I'd love to see the Greens actually go back to the Greens of 1996, I think it was, before they changed their policy and population, when they used to have a stable population manifesto. And unfortunately, the rise of One Nation caused the Greens to change their policy because they didn't want to be perceived as racist. And so now the Greens have become a big Australian party as well. So unfortunately, we're definitely up against it. You've got the trifecta of the three majors, all big Australia. You've got obviously some sort of popular sentiments on the right who are pushing back against it, but unfortunately that's, if anything, that could be harming us. We need someone from the centre to push the issue, or alternatively, I'll tell you the secret for Labor getting elected next election: to actually go hard on immigration and do it in the right way. Use it as a way to make, as a housing affordability platform, as a way to support workers and wages. And also on an environmental front. So I'd love to see Labor swing and go for a more sensible intake, but unfortunately, from what I've seen, they're more open borders than the coalition. So yeah, we're up against it.
Okay, thank you very much. Would you please put your hands together and thank Bob and Leith for their... Now, we have morning tea through that door, and I'm asking if you would consider giving a donation to help defray costs for today. But you've now got that book of what Bob called killer facts. So go forth, spread the message. You'll be able to tell your friends about it. There are now links up on our website. We just need to keep on getting the message out, and it really is in there in that booklet. Thank you.